Hi, the Western Dime Novel by Todd Anselmo. Dime novels are short works of fiction, usually costing 5 or 10 cents, that were generally focused on the perilous and often miraculously dramatic exploits of a single heroic character, and with the added draw of a sensational black and white or color cover illustration depicting an action scene related to the story. The term dime novel actually became the go-to moniker for blood and thunder or sensational detective novels in pamphlet form, and not necessarily because of the price, which varied generally between a half dime and a dime. Dime novels were usually sold in series and numbered by series and volume, with one story ending with a cliffhanger to entice the reader to await the purchase of the next volume. This not only made for a returning audience, but also allowed the publishers to describe these novels as periodicals rather than books, and which could be mailed at a substantially lower rate. I guess sort of like the media mail of its day, what we have today. Initially written for working lower middle class literate adults of all ages, the dime novel ended becoming extremely popular over its heyday to boys and young men who ended up as the primary purchasers and readers of the genre, which was often passed to family and friends, often in secret due to its reputation as a corrupting influence and path to perdition, as a bane or described by the middle and upper class, even as the increasingly more effective means of printing, marketing, distribution all assisted the literacy rate of this lower and middle class and lessened the divide between the poor and the privileged. The dime novel flourished from the mid-19th century through the early decades of the 20th century, generally through the later part of the 1800s. The dime novel, which was also called the penny dreadful or the shilling shocker in England, was largely a pre-pulp fiction type of publication, generally characterized as a periodical with a lurid or attention-grabbing cover, and also as a story paper, which included illustrations within the pages of the book, in addition to the cover illustration, where the dime novel was just had the cover illustration. The content was wide and varied, with stereotypical tales of detective stories, Wild West adventures, historical romances, master criminal and spy situations, and tales of working girls and boys, meaning working as in working for a living in harsh conditions, not as we know the term working girls to mean today, but where hard work and virtue earned positive social and moral rewards, if not necessarily financial ones. The Western was the first major narrative genre in dime novels, where the greatest focus was on the Wild West of America, and which continued to be for the rest of the 19th century. And it maintained a patriotic theme of young men battling tirelessly to uphold virtue and avoid vice, while adventurously and romantically fulfilling the role of the good against the evil of the enemy, whether that be the pirates or the French, or the English during the French and American Revolutionary Wars. Inventors and inventions were included in this class, or in the case of the Western was the incorrigible and the savage Indians, of course, who harassed and raided the white settlers in the untamed Wild West of the United States, regardless of who was there first, and not getting into that debate. In fact, even though these novels could hardly ever be considered mediocre as far as writing standards, they were highly conventional in regards to the times and what were considered contemporary standards of conduct, with the dime novel characters especially. Although they were generally involved in violent and bloody events, they were virtuous to the point of they never drank alcohol, didn't smoke, didn't curse, didn't gamble, which I found interesting. So while the year 1860 is officially considered the beginning of the age of the dime novel, and its role to romanticize and exaggerate the settling of the Far West, and depict the conflicts between good and evil, cowboys and the Indians, the law and the outlaws. Its precursor actually originated decades earlier with James Fenimore Cooper, who had written a book called The Pilot, which included Leatherstocking Tales and High Sea Adventures, which actually was kind of the leading into where the dime novel came about. So by the 1830s, with the advancement of the technology at the time, such as the steam, rotary press, and railroad networks, it allowed the limited audiences from before to overcome the restrictions of available reading materials due to the high cost of the hardcover books, the lack of access, the lack of public libraries, the slow and unreliable distribution systems. When that started being overcome, they were able to become more active and regular purchasers and readers of books. And the Brother Jonathan weekly story papers became very successful in the late 1830s, around 1839. That years later, that was what Erastus and Irwin Beadle collaborated on and based their novel on to write the novel-length story that sold for the price of one dime. And the success of this novel created the industry that was to succeed and excel for the next 50 or 60 years or so. So a few years after establishing the publishing company called Beadle's Dime Novels in 1856, with a third person named Robert Adams, the brothers Erastus and Irwin Beadle debuted the first official dime novel called Maleska, the Indian Wife of the White Hunter, by Anne S. Stevens in 1860. The romantic sensationalism of this tragic tale was a hit with the public, and it sold more than 65,000 issues in just the first few months. So, needless to say, the success of this novel, as well as a new advertising campaign, allowed the Beatles to publish and sell several novels in the immediate aftermath, including Edward Ellis's The Adventures of Seth Jones, which sold 600,000 copies and was a favorite of Abraham Lincoln, our president at the time. This incredibly quick success had the Beatles publishing a new dime novel every 2 weeks, and after 1 year, one new novel every week. And after a few years, in 1963, amazingly, one of the brothers, Irwin Beadle, sold his interest in the company to Robert Adams, who was the third person to start that publishing company, and Beadle's dime novels became Beadles and Adams, and where it really took off for the next couple of decades. So before his death in 1894, Erasmus Beadle had issued at different times popular songbooks, magazines, story papers, handbooks, books of other genres, but he was most well known for somewhere around 25 series of novels, and he had retired with a fortune of more than $3 million at the time in the late 1880s. During the Civil War, the dime novel sales surged. They were a source of entertainment for soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Beadle opened up a London office in 1862 to introduce his dime novels to English readers, and it was here that the terms penny dreadfuls and shilling shockers became popular because of the exaggerated content of the dime novels from America over in England. And while the Civil War presented an opportunity for increased sales, it would eventually be a part of the dime novels slide in popularity. And around the same time, a company called Frank Starr and Company began cranking out dime western novels in the mid-1860s as well. And the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s really belonged to Beadle and his company, and he didn't disappoint. His success encouraged others to cash in the popularity, including Frank Starr and Company, George and Norman Monroe, Francis Street, Francis Smith, Frank Toucey, and others. They entered the business and competed heavily and sometimes ruthlessly for a share of the readers. But as usual, after a while, the market became glutted, and more outlandish tales had to be made up just to keep ahead of the last crazy tale, and to keep people, looking for that next book in the series, and to keep the revenues flowing. So eventually, although the dime novel began with morality-based tales based on real-life heroes such as Daniel Boone, Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, who Buffalo Bill was by far the most written about character, Texas Jack, Bigfoot Wallace, the demand for more suspense action over the decades led to new and wildly improbable characters that had to be made up because they had run out of ideas, and new characters such as Deadwood Dick, Rattlesnake Ned, Deadshot Dave, the Black Avenger, and others, and as well as more absurd but very violent-ridden stories that began to the readers began to lose interest in them, and actually began to gain the wrath of older people, parents especially, who were beginning to object to the emphasis on such sensationalism and violence and just overdone emotionalism. So the morality aspect also began to turn as outlaws after the Civil War. Such outlaws like the Youngers and Jesse James and Billy the Kid and train robbers and criminals began to gain popularity as social heroes in these dime novels, and disrespect for the law began to dominate the tales, which was kind of, after 30 years, was going against the grain of the morality of how they were originally developed, even with the violence. And so combine that, let's see, the real life atrocities and blood and gore and the death of the Civil War and the hardships and everything that divided that country, our country, combined with the canonization basically of criminals created by the war, and what they had to do to survive after it, and the division of these loyalties, well, it started to lessen the excitement of the dime novels. And by the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, began to start dropping off because they were becoming too real for the comfort that they used to have, and the morality lessons were giving way to desperation and outlaw edification and just outright outlandish and ridiculous plots, storylines. So the dime novel is basically just running out of ideas and ways to portray an era that had disappeared. So as the civilization changed, technology changed, cities grew and became civilized, different types of stories were becoming somewhat popular, detective stories, magazines, books such as Secret Service, Fame and Fortune, Pluck and Luck, periodicals, and they were kind of in the early 1900s, and they were eventually purchased by Street and Smith, a company that developed just a year or two after they purchased most of these other dime novels, and converted these into the pulp fiction, which became the new kind of dime novel during the next several decades after that, and that occurred in around 1926. So there were some elements of the Western dime novel hung around through the Depression era, but generally the dime novel was done by the late 1920s, and the very few hangers-on finally died out about 1937. So that's a brief history of the dime novel, and for Info 668, the winner of 2014, and thank you very much.